Injured bird flies to human for help. The way they bond is unbelievable. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light over the quiet countryside. The air was filled with the sounds of nature. Crickets chirping, birds calling to each other in the trees, and the gentle rustle of leaves as the breeze swept through the forest. Tom sat on the creaking wooden porch of his small cabin, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. This was his favorite time of day, just before evening, when the world seemed to settle into a peaceful rhythm. The cabin had been his home for years now, tucked away at the edge of the woods. Tom had always preferred the solitude. He wasn't one for crowds or noise, not anymore. He found comfort in the quiet moments, in the sounds of the forest, and in the slow, steady routines that filled his days. But today was different. Tom's gaze drifted over the yard, where the tall grass swayed gently in the wind. Something caught his eye, a flash of movement small and frantic at the edge of the tree-line. He squinted, leaning forward as he tried to make out what it was. At first, he thought it was a leaf caught in the breeze, but as it moved closer, he realized it was something else entirely. A bird, a small robin, fluttering unevenly through the air. Its wings beat weakly, its movements slow and desperate as it struggled to stay aloft. Tom frowned, setting his mug down on the railing. "What's wrong with you?" he murmured to himself, watching the bird's erratic flight. The robin flapped once more, and then, as though it couldn't hold itself up any longer, it dipped sharply toward the ground. Tom stood quickly, his heart lurching as the little creature landed with a soft thud a few feet away from the porch. For a moment, everything was still. The robin lay there, its tiny chest rising and falling as it struggled to breathe. Tom's boots crunched against the gravel as he stepped off the porch and crouched down beside the bird. His rough, calloused hands hovered in the air for a moment before he reached out, careful not to startle it. "What happened to you, little one?" he murmured softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Up close, Tom could see the bird's injury. A jagged tear in its wing, the feathers matted with blood. Its small, dark eyes blinked slowly, as though trying to understand who or what had approached. Tom's chest tightened. He wasn't a veterinarian. He didn't know the first thing about taking care of an injured bird. But he also couldn't leave it here to suffer. "It's okay," he said gently, reaching out to scoop the robin into his hands. He expected it to panic, to flutter or peck in protest, but the bird remained still, its tiny body trembling slightly in his grip. The trust startled him. "You're tougher than you look," Tom murmured, his voice soft. He cradled the robin carefully as he stood, shielding it from the wind with his body. "Let's get you inside. We'll figure this out together." Tom set the robin down gently on a folded towel in the corner of his small living room. The makeshift nest was the best he could do for now. A soft, warm place where the bird could rest without being disturbed. He crouched beside it, studying the tiny creature with furrowed brows. The wound on its wing was bad, he could see that much, but it didn't look hopeless. "You're lucky I found you," Tom said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the bird or to himself. "Or maybe I'm lucky you found me." The robin blinked up at him, its small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. There was something in its gaze, something steady despite the pain. It was as though the bird understood that Tom was trying to help. Tom stood up, running a hand through his short, graying hair. "All right, first things first. We need to clean that wing." The next few minutes were spent rummaging through the old wooden cabinets in his kitchen. Tom had always been practical, so his first aid kit was well-stocked: bandages, antiseptic wipes, and a small bottle of saline solution. He grabbed what he needed and returned to the bird, kneeling down beside it once more. "This might sting a little," he said softly, holding up the saline bottle. The robin didn't move, though its feathers fluffed slightly as Tom carefully dripped the solution onto the wound. Tom worked slowly, his hands steady as he cleaned the injury. He was careful not to touch the torn edges of the wing too much, afraid of causing more pain. Once the blood was cleaned away, he could see that the damage, while significant, wasn't beyond healing. "You'll be okay," Tom murmured, as much to himself as to the robin. "You just need some time." He gently wrapped the wing with a strip of clean gauze, securing it so the bird wouldn't be able to move it too much. When he was finished, he sat back on his heels, letting out a long breath. The robin blinked up at him, its dark eyes calm. Tom smiled faintly, shaking his head. "You're braver than most, you know that?" The bird didn't respond, of course, but something about the way it looked at him made Tom's chest ache. It had been years since he'd cared for anything, years since he'd let anything or anyone get close enough to matter. And yet here he was, sitting on the floor of his living room, talking to an injured bird like it could understand every word. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed, staring up at the wooden ceiling as the sounds of the forest filtered in through the open window. The chirping crickets, the soft rustle of leaves. They were sounds he knew well, sounds that had always brought him comfort. But tonight, his thoughts kept drifting back to the robin. He could still see its small, trembling body, its bloodied wing tucked carefully against its side. The trust it had shown him, the way it hadn't struggled when he picked it up or cleaned its wound, lingered in his mind like an unanswered question. "Why me?" Tom turned onto his side, pulling the blanket higher as he let out a heavy sigh. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe the bird had been too weak to fight back, and he was reading too much into it. But deep down, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. The next morning, Tom woke early. The sun had just begun to rise, bathing the world in soft, golden light. He pulled on his boots and padded quietly into the living room, half expecting to find the bird lifeless on the towel. But to his surprise, the robin was awake. It sat in the makeshift nest, its head tilted slightly as it watched him enter the room. Tom smiled faintly, crouching down beside it. "Good morning," he said softly. "You made it through the night." The robin let out a faint chirp, its beak opening just slightly as though to respond. Tom chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a tough little thing, aren't you?" He grabbed a small dish from the kitchen and filled it with water, setting it down near the towel. He also tore a piece of bread into tiny crumbs, placing them nearby in case the bird was hungry. "There," he said, sitting back as he watched. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing." The robin stared at him for a long moment before hopping forward, its small claws tapping against the towel as it made its way to the water dish. It dipped its beak into the water, drinking in small, careful sips. Tom's smile widened. "That's it," he murmured. "You're going to be okay." For the first time in a long time, Tom felt something stir in his chest, something he couldn't quite name. It was a sense of purpose, maybe, or connection, a reminder that he wasn't as alone as he had thought. As the robin finished drinking and settled back into the nest, Tom leaned back against the wall, his arms resting on his knees. "Guess we're stuck with each other for a while," he said softly, watching as the bird's eyes began to close in sleep. "You and me, little one." The robin didn't respond, but it didn't need to. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel so empty. The days began to follow a quiet but comforting rhythm. Tom's life, once marked by routine solitude, now revolved around caring for the small bird he had taken in. Each morning, he would carefully check on Rusty, the name he'd decided to give the robin, inspired by the reddish hue of its chest. "Morning, Rusty," he'd say softly, kneeling beside the little makeshift nest. "How are we doing today?" Rusty had grown used to his voice, tilting his head in response as though listening. The gauze on his wing had remained intact, and while he still couldn't fly, Tom could see small signs of improvement each day. The robin moved with more energy, hopping around the towel-lined corner and chirping softly whenever Tom came near. At first, Tom had worried about feeding him properly. Breadcrumbs and water were simple enough, but he knew birds needed more to thrive. After a quick internet search, done on the old, dusty laptop he rarely used, Tom learned how to make a more suitable meal. He mixed bits of fruit, softened grains, and a small amount of protein-rich food to keep Rusty strong. The bird ate eagerly, his little beak pecking at the dish with enthusiasm. It brought a smile to Tom's face every time. You've got some fight in you, don't you? Tom murmured one afternoon, watching Rusty hop from one corner of the nest to the other. I like that about you, the robin chirped in response, fluttering his wings slightly. It was a faint movement, but it was progress, and Tom felt a swell of pride watching it. The bond between Tom and Rusty grew in ways Tom hadn't expected. At first, he had assumed the bird would remain fearful, that its wild instincts would keep it at a cautious distance. But Rusty seemed to trust Tom completely, hopping onto his hand whenever he offered it. The first time it happened, Tom had been caught off guard, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor with his hand resting near the nest. Rusty had tilted his head, studying Tom's fingers as though debating what to do. And then, in a sudden, surprising motion, the little bird had hopped forward, landing gently on his knuckles. Tom had frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as he stared at the robin perched on his hand. Well, he muttered softly, his voice tinged with awe. You're braver than I thought, Rusty chirped softly, flapping his wings once before settling in. Tom smiled, his rough exterior softening as he watched the bird, amazed at the quiet bond forming between them. From that moment on, Rusty seemed to see Tom as more than just a caretaker. He became a companion of sorts, hopping onto Tom's hand or shoulder whenever he got the chance. Tom took to talking to him throughout the day, his voice low and steady as though speaking to an old friend. You know, I didn't think I'd ever have company out here, Tom admitted one evening, as Rusty perched on the arm of the old couch. I've been on my own for a long time. Never really minded it, to be honest. Rusty tilted his head, as though listening. Tom chuckled, shaking his head. But you're something else, little guy. You don't ask for much, do you? Just some food, a safe place, and a bit of company. The robin chirped in response, fluttering his wings slightly before settling back down. Tom smiled faintly, leaning back against the couch cushions. Maybe that's all any of us need. As the days stretched into weeks, Rusty's strength continued to improve. Tom began to notice small but important changes. The way Rusty fluttered his wings more often, testing them with cautious determination, or the way he hopped onto higher surfaces with growing confidence. One morning, Tom decided it was time to remove the bandage from Rusty's wing. He had been careful to monitor the injury, making sure it had healed properly, and now the gauze looked loose and frayed. All right, Rusty, Tom said, kneeling beside the little nest. Time to see how you're doing. The robin chirped softly, hopping toward him as though he knew what was coming. Tom worked carefully, his fingers gentle as he unwound the gauze from Rusty's wing. He held his breath as he removed the last bit, worried about what he might find. But when the bandage fell away, Tom let out a quiet sigh of relief. The wound had healed almost completely, leaving only a faint scar where the feathers had been torn. There you go, Tom murmured, smiling down at Rusty. Good as new, almost. Rusty stretched his wing tentatively, flapping it once, then twice. Tom watched with a mixture of pride and hope as the robin tested its strength, the movement smooth and unencumbered. You're going to fly again, aren't you? Tom said softly, his voice full of awe. Rusty chirped loudly, as though agreeing with him. Tom sat back on his heels, watching as the robin hopped to the edge of the nest and flapped his wings again. It wasn't quite enough to lift him off the ground, but it was close. Closer than Tom had seen since the day Rusty landed at his feet, broken and bleeding. You're almost there, Tom said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Just a little more time. That evening, Tom sat on the porch, the sun dipping low in the sky as he cradled a steaming mug of tea in his hands. Rusty perched on his shoulder, his tiny claws gripping the worn fabric of Tom's shirt. It had become their ritual, the two of them sitting together on the porch, watching the world grow quiet as the day faded into night. Tom glanced at the bird, a faint smile on his face. You're going to leave soon, aren't you? Rusty didn't respond, of course, but Tom could feel the truth of his own words settling heavily in his chest. The robin's wing was healing, stronger every day, and it was only a matter of time before Rusty was ready to fly. And when that day came, Tom knew he would have to let him go. The thought brought a sharp pang of sadness, one that caught Tom off guard. He had never expected to care so much about a bird, of all things. But Rusty had been more than just a creature he'd nursed back to health. He had been a friend, a quiet presence that had filled the empty spaces in Tom's life without ever asking for anything in return. "You'll be happier out there," Tom said softly, staring out at the treeline. "That's where you belong." Rusty fluttered his wings slightly, as though responding to Tom's words. Tom sighed, setting his mug down on the railing as he reached up to stroke the bird's soft feathers. "It's okay," he murmured. "I knew this wasn't forever." The robin chirped quietly, its small body warm against Tom's shoulder. For a long time, the two of them sat there in silence, the only sounds the distant calls of other birds and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Tom closed his eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. He knew the day would come soon. Maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day. But for now, he was content to sit here, the little bird perched beside him, and savor the time they had left. The next morning, Tom awoke to the sound of chirping outside his window. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes as he listened. The sound was familiar, clear and bright, filled with energy. Rusty. Tom's heart leapt as he hurried downstairs and opened the door to the porch. There, perched on the railing, was Rusty. His wing, once broken and bloodied, spread wide as he flapped them proudly. Tom smiled, his chest swelling with pride and bittersweet joy. "Look at you," he said softly, stepping out onto the porch. "You're ready, aren't you?" Rusty chirped loudly, hopping toward him before fluttering into the air. For a moment, he hovered just a few feet above the railing, his wings beating steadily. Tom held his breath, watching as the little robin rose higher, the sunlight catching the reddish feathers on his chest. And then, with a final chirp, Rusty took off, soaring into the morning sky, his small silhouette disappearing into the trees. Tom watched him go, his smile softening as he let out a slow breath. "Goodbye, little guy," he murmured. "You did it." He stood there for a long time, staring at the place where Rusty had vanished. The quiet settled over the cabin again, but this time, it didn't feel empty. Rusty had come to Tom when he needed help, but in the end, Tom realized something he hadn't expected. The little bird had helped him, too. Tom stood on the porch for what felt like hours after Rusty had disappeared into the trees. The cool morning breeze brushed against his face, carrying the faint rustle of leaves and the songs of other birds deeper in the woods. Despite the stillness around him, Tom's thoughts were a whirlwind. He had known this day would come, the day Rusty would fly away healed and whole. He had prepared himself for it, or at least he thought he had. But as he stood there now, staring out at the spot where the robin had vanished, he couldn't deny the ache in his chest. Tom had spent years learning to live alone, building a life of quiet routines and simple comforts. He told himself he didn't need anyone, that solitude suited him just fine. But Rusty had reminded him of something he hadn't realized he'd been missing, a sense of connection, a purpose beyond himself. With a heavy sigh, Tom turned and went back inside. The cabin felt quieter now, more still than it had in weeks. Rusty's makeshift nest still sat in the corner, the little towel-lined space where the robin had spent so many nights. Tom hesitated before kneeling down beside it, running his fingers along the edge of the towel. "You did good, Rusty," he murmured softly. The empty nest was a small thing, but its presence carried weight. It was a reminder of everything Tom had shared with the little bird. The quiet mornings spent watching him drink water, the evenings when Rusty perched on his shoulder, chirping softly as though telling him stories of the outside world. Tom let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You sure made a mess of me, didn't you?" He stood up, taking a deep breath as he looked around the room. It was the same cabin it had always been, small, simple, and filled with the quiet that Tom had always sought. But something felt different now, like a door had been opened that he wasn't sure he could close again. That afternoon, Tom decided to keep himself busy. He spent hours in the yard, chopping wood and tending to the small garden he had planted at the start of spring. The physical work gave him something to focus on, something to keep his hands moving and his mind from wandering too far. But every so often, his gaze would drift toward the treeline, searching for a flash of movement, a sign that Rusty had returned. "Don't be foolish," he told himself. "Birds belong in the wild. That's where he's supposed to be." Still, the habit persisted, and Tom couldn't help but feel a small pang of disappointment each time he realized the robin wasn't there. By the time evening fell, Tom was exhausted. He sat on the porch with a mug of tea, watching as the sky turned shades of orange and pink. The world felt quiet again, but this time, it was a little too quiet. Tom found himself missing the sound of Rusty's soft chirps, the way the little bird would hop onto his shoulder as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "You're losing it, old man," Tom muttered to himself, shaking his head. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. Rusty had changed something in him, and there was no going back to the way things were before. The next morning, Tom woke to the sound of tapping. At first, he thought he was dreaming. The rhythmic sound echoed softly through the cabin, like someone gently knocking on the window. Tom groaned, pulling the blanket over his head as he tried to ignore it. But the tapping continued, growing more insistent until finally, Tom sat up with a grumble. All right, I'm coming." He shuffled out of bed and into the living room, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he looked around. The tapping had stopped, and for a moment he wondered if he'd imagined it. And then he saw it. Rusty. The little robin sat perched on the windowsill outside, his bright chest puffed out as he stared into the cabin. Tom froze, his heart skipping a beat as he stared back at the bird. "You've got to be kidding me," he whispered. Rusty chirped loudly, hopping along the edge of the sill as though impatient for Tom to open the window. Tom let out a disbelieving laugh, shaking his head as he hurried to unlatch it. The window creaked as Tom pushed it open, and Rusty fluttered inside, landing neatly on the edge of the table. He chirped again, tilting his head as though greeting Tom after a long absence. "Well, I'll be," Tom muttered, grinning as he stepped closer. "You came back." Rusty hopped toward him, his wings fluttering as he lifted off the table and landed gently on Tom's shoulder. The familiar weight of the bird made Tom's chest tighten with a mix of relief and joy. "I thought you were gone for good, little guy," Tom said softly, reaching up to stroke Rusty's feathers. "What are you doing back here?" Rusty chirped in response, nuzzling against Tom's neck as though to answer the question. Tom let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Guess you missed me, huh?" The robin stayed perched on Tom's shoulder as he moved about the cabin, going through his usual morning routine. It felt like old times. Tom talking to Rusty as he made his coffee, the bird hopping around the room or perching near the window to watch the world outside. But this time, something was different. Rusty was free now. He could come and go as he pleased. Tom had done what he'd set out to do. He had healed the little bird, given him the chance to return to the life he was meant to live. And yet, Rusty had come back. The thought made Tom smile as he sat at the kitchen table, his coffee cup warming his hands. "You know you don't have to stay here, right?" he said softly, glancing at the robin perched on the windowsill. "You can leave any time you want." Rusty chirped once, fluttering his wings before hopping closer. Tom watched him, his smile softening. "I'm glad you're here, though," he admitted quietly. "It's nice to have the company." Over the next few weeks, Rusty became a regular presence in Tom's life. Some mornings, Tom would wake to find the robin perched on the window, tapping gently until he let him inside. Other days, Rusty would disappear for hours, only to return in the evening as the sun began to set. Tom didn't mind. He liked knowing that Rusty had the freedom to come and go as he pleased. It made the bond between them feel even more special, like a friendship built on trust and choice, rather than necessity. Rusty's visits brought a new sense of joy to Tom's life. The little bird had a way of making everything feel lighter, whether it was the way he chirped happily as Tom worked in the garden or the way he perched on Tom's shoulder as they watched the sunset together. Tom found himself smiling more often, laughing at Rusty's antics as the robin darted around the cabin, chasing bits of string or hopping onto Tom's tools as though inspecting his work. It was a simple kind of happiness, but it was enough. One evening, as Tom sat on the porch with Rusty perched beside him, he looked out at the horizon and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Contentment. The cabin, once a place of quiet isolation, had become something more, a home, filled with life and warmth. Rusty had reminded Tom of what it meant to care for something, to open his heart and let someone or something in. "You're a miracle, you know that?" Tom said softly, glancing down at the little bird. "I didn't think I needed anyone, but you showed me different," Rusty chirped in response, fluttering his wings before settling back down. Tom smiled, leaning back in his chair as he let the moment wash over him. The world was quiet, but it wasn't empty, and for the first time in a long time, Tom realized he wasn't alone. The days continued to pass, each one blending seamlessly into the next. Tom's life, once marked by an almost unbearable stillness, had found a new rhythm. Rusty had become a fixture, his presence as familiar as the creak of the porch or the soft hum of the forest at dusk. It amazed Tom how quickly he'd adjusted to sharing his world with such a small, fragile creature. Mornings now began with Rusty tapping on the window, his beak tapping rhythmically against the glass as though calling Tom to wake up. All right, Tom would grumble with mock irritation, dragging himself out of bed to open the window. "You're lucky you're cute, little guy." Rusty would hop onto the sill, chirping brightly before fluttering to Tom's shoulder as he made coffee or prepared his breakfast. Tom always laughed at how natural it felt, as though the bird had always belonged there. "Who'd have thought I'd be making breakfast for a bird?" Tom said one morning, dropping crumbs of bread and fruit into a small dish he'd set aside just for Rusty. Rusty chirped in response, hopping closer to peck eagerly at the food. Tom watched him with a faint smile, his mug of coffee warming his hands. The little robin had become a constant source of joy, a reminder of the unexpected beauty that life could offer when you least expected it. Tom had grown accustomed to Rusty's comings and goings. Some days, the bird would disappear into the woods for hours at a time, only to return at dusk, chirping brightly as though sharing stories of his adventures. Tom would listen, of course, responding with quiet chuckles and murmured replies. "What did you find out there today? Huh?" Tom would ask, leaning back in his chair as Rusty perched on the railing of the porch. "Any new friends? Or are you just showing off that fancy wing of yours?" Rusty would fluff his feathers in response, as though proud of his recovery. Tom couldn't help but feel a swell of pride too. He'd helped this little creature heal, given him a second chance at life. And in return, Rusty had given Tom something he hadn't realized he'd been missing: companionship, purpose, and a sense of connection to the world around him. It was strange, Tom thought, how such a small bird could make such a big difference. One afternoon, Tom decided to take a walk into the woods. It was something he hadn't done in years, not since his early days at the cabin, when he still felt the urge to explore the vast expanse of wilderness that surrounded him. But now, with Rusty flitting happily at his side, the idea of wandering through the forest didn't feel so daunting. The woods were alive with the sounds of nature. Birds called to each other from the treetops, their songs filling the air with a melody that felt both ancient and timeless. The leaves rustled in the breeze, and the sunlight filtered through the branches in soft, golden beams. Rusty darted ahead, hopping from branch to branch as he chirped excitedly, as though encouraging Tom to keep up. "All right, slow down," Tom called, laughing softly. "Some of us can't fly, you know." Rusty flapped his wings in response, landing on a low branch just ahead of Tom. His bright chest puffed out proudly as he chirped again, as if to say, "Come on, keep moving." Tom shook his head with a smile, his boots crunching softly against the forest floor as he continued walking. There was something peaceful about being out here, surrounded by nothing but the sounds of the woods and the quiet presence of his feathered companion. After a while, Tom reached a small clearing where a narrow stream trickled through the grass. The water was clear and cool, its surface shimmering in the sunlight. Tom knelt beside it, cupping his hands to drink as Rusty landed nearby, pecking at the ground as though searching for insects. Tom sat back on his heels, watching the robin with quiet contentment. You know, he said softly, I used to come out here all the time when I first moved in. I thought I'd find something. Peace, maybe, or answers to questions I didn't even know how to ask. Rusty chirped, hopping closer to where Tom sat. Tom let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. I didn't find much, though, just a lot of quiet. And I guess that's what I thought I wanted. He looked up at the sky, watching as a hawk soared high above the treetops. Turns out, quiet isn't all it's cracked up to be, he murmured. Rusty fluttered onto Tom's knee, tilting his head as though listening. Tom smiled faintly, reaching out to stroke the soft feathers along the bird's back. But you showed up, didn't you? Tom continued, his voice low. Broke right through all that quiet and made yourself at home. And I didn't even realize how much I needed you. Rusty chirped softly, his small claws gripping Tom's knee as though offering reassurance. Tom let out a long breath, his gaze drifting back to the stream. For the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him. A weight lifting, a door opening. It was as though Rusty had reminded him of something he'd forgotten. That life was meant to be shared. That even the smallest connections could make the world feel brighter. Over the next few weeks, Tom and Rusty fell into an easy rhythm. Rusty still spent much of his time exploring the woods, but he always came back. Whether it was to perch on Tom's shoulder as he worked in the garden, or to chirp softly at the window until Tom let him inside. Tom began to look forward to those moments, the quiet companionship that Rusty offered. He found himself talking to the bird more often, sharing stories about his past, the things he had never spoken aloud to anyone else. Did I ever tell you about my dad? Tom said one evening, as Rusty perched on the edge of the table. He was the one who taught me how to build things, how to work with my hands. Said there was something honest about it. I didn't appreciate it back then, but now, I get it. Rusty chirped softly, as though encouraging him to continue. Tom smiled faintly, staring down at his hands. I think he'd like this place. Simple, quiet, nothing fancy. It's what he always wanted, you know? A little piece of land, far from the noise of the world. He glanced up at the robin, his smile softening. Funny how things work out, isn't it? I spent so many years running from all that, and now here I am, living the life he always dreamed of. Rusty tilted his head, hopping closer. Tom reached out to stroke the bird's feathers, his voice growing quiet. Guess we're both lucky we found each other. Huh? As the days grew warmer, Tom noticed something remarkable. Rusty had started singing. It was a soft, melodic sound at first, but over time it grew louder and more confident. Every morning, Tom would wake to the sound of Rusty's song drifting through the cabin window, a gentle reminder of the little bird who had come into his life when he needed it most. One morning, as Tom sat on the porch with his coffee, he watched Rusty perched on the railing, his bright chest glowing in the morning light as he sang his heart out. You've got quite the voice, don't you? Tom said softly, smiling as he watched. I guess that's your way of saying thank you. Rusty paused, glancing back at Tom before chirping once and taking off into the sky. Tom watched him go, his smile lingering as he leaned back in his chair. The little robin had come so far, from the day he landed at Tom's feet, broken and bleeding, to the strong, confident bird he had become. Tom couldn't help but feel proud, not just of Rusty, but of himself, too. He had opened his heart to something small and fragile, and in return, Rusty had shown him what it meant to care again. As the robin disappeared into the treetops, Tom took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. He knew Rusty would be back. He always came back. And in the meantime, Tom would be here waiting. The days began to grow longer, and summer settled into the woods with a golden glow. Tom could feel the shift in the air, warmer, gentler, and alive with the sound of birdsong. Rusty, as always, remained a faithful companion. He would come and go throughout the day, his small, bright form flitting through the trees only to return to Tom's porch in the evenings. One morning, Tom woke to something new. It wasn't just Rusty's tapping on the window this time. It was louder, persistent, curious. Tom rolled out of bed, grumbling softly as he rubbed his eyes. All right, what's the matter with you today? He opened the window, expecting Rusty to flutter inside like always. Instead, Rusty was perched just outside, hopping along the ledge. But he wasn't alone. Another robin sat beside him, a smaller bird with brighter plumage and curious, darting eyes. Tom froze, blinking in disbelief. "Well, look at that," he muttered with a smile. "You brought a friend, huh?" Rusty chirped loudly, as though proud of himself. The other bird flapped its wings hesitantly before settling down on the ledge. Tom couldn't help but laugh, leaning his forearms against the sill as he watched them. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" he said softly, looking at Rusty. "First you show up here out of nowhere, and now you've gone and made yourself a family." The thought made Tom pause, his smile softening as the weight of it hit him. Rusty had healed, not just in body, but in spirit too. And now, after everything they'd been through together, Rusty had found something new. A companion, a partner to share his world with. Tom straightened, reaching for his old work shirt draped over the chair. "Come on then," he said, stepping onto the porch. "Let's see what the day brings." That morning felt different, brighter, somehow. The pair of robins followed Tom around as he went about his chores, their chirps filling the air like music. Rusty was more energetic than usual, darting back and forth between the trees, as though showing off for his new friend. Tom watched them with quiet amusement, shaking his head as he dug his hands into the soil of the garden. "Guess you've got someone to impress now, huh?" Rusty chirped loudly in response, landing on a nearby fence post and puffing out his chest. The other bird followed, perching beside him with delicate grace. Tom grinned, the sight filling him with a strange kind of pride. "You two make a good pair," he murmured, brushing the dirt from his hands. "Don't mess it up, all right?" As silly as it felt, Tom found himself talking to the birds more often now, sharing bits of advice, stories, and the occasional joke as he worked. It wasn't much, but it made the days feel fuller, the quiet of the woods less lonely. Rusty and his companion became a part of Tom's routine. They would perch on the porch railing in the mornings, chirping eagerly as Tom sipped his coffee. In the evenings, they would disappear into the trees, their songs drifting back toward the cabin like a farewell. Tom didn't mind. He liked knowing they were out there, living their lives freely but always coming back to the place where it all began. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom sat on the porch with a book in his lap and Rusty perched on his knee. The other robin, whom Tom had taken to calling Rose, hopped along the railing, chirping softly as the world grew quiet. Tom glanced down at Rusty, his smile faint but full of warmth. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" he said softly. Rusty tilted his head, his bright eyes meeting Tom's. "When you showed up here, I didn't know what to do with you," Tom continued, his voice low. "I thought I was helping you, saving you from whatever had happened out there. But the truth is," he paused, his throat tightening slightly, "you saved me too," Rusty chirped, flapping his wings before settling back down. Tom leaned back in his chair, letting the moment wash over him. It was strange to think about how much had changed in such a short time. Before Rusty, the cabin had been quiet, too quiet. The days had blended into one another, marked only by the passing of the seasons and the slow, steady rhythm of Tom's routine. But now everything felt different. The cabin was alive with the sound of Rusty's chirps, the flutter of wings, and the faint echo of laughter. Tom's laughter, something he hadn't heard in his own voice for years. Rusty had brought light back into Tom's life, and for that, he would always be grateful. As the weeks turned into months, the robins remained a constant presence in Tom's world. Rusty and Rose built a small nest in one of the trees near the cabin, and Tom took quiet satisfaction in watching them from a distance. He could see them darting back and forth between the branches, chirping happily as they worked together to build their home. One morning, Tom woke to a new sound, a chorus of soft, high-pitched chirps drifting in through the open window. He smiled, sitting up in bed as he listened. "Sounds like congratulations are in order," he muttered, pulling on his boots. Sure enough, when Tom stepped outside, he saw Rusty and Rose perched near the nest, their bright chests glowing in the morning light. Tiny beaks poked up from the nest, their soft chirps filling the air. Tom felt his chest tighten, his smile growing as he leaned against the porch railing. "Well, look at that," he said softly. "You're a dad now, huh, Rusty?" The robin chirped proudly, fluttering down to perch on the railing beside Tom. Tom reached out to stroke Rusty's feathers, his voice gentle. "You've got a good life ahead of you," he murmured. "You did good, little guy. Real good." For a long time, Tom stood there, watching as the robins tended to their tiny family. It was a simple thing, but it filled him with a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. Rusty had found his place in the world, a place of love, connection, and new beginnings. And in a way, so had Tom. That evening, as Tom sat on the porch with a mug of tea, he watched the sun dip below the trees, its golden light casting long shadows across the yard. The woods were quiet, save for the distant songs of birds and the soft hum of insects. Rusty and Rose perched on the railing, their feathers glowing in the fading light. Tom smiled, raising his mug in a quiet toast. "To new beginnings," he said softly. The robins chirped in response, their wings fluttering as though they understood. Tom leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. The cabin, once a place of solitude, had become something more, a home, alive with the sound of life and the quiet magic of nature. And as the stars began to appear overhead, Tom realized something important. Rusty hadn't just been a bird. He had been a symbol, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could change the world. That love, trust, and connection could come from the most unexpected places. Tom closed his eyes, listening to the gentle chirps of the robins as they settled in for the night. "I'll be here," he whispered softly, as though speaking to Rusty, to Rose, and to the little family they had built. "Whenever you need me." The woods were still, the air cool and fresh. And in that moment, Tom knew he wasn't alone. Not anymore. Because love, in all its forms, had a way of finding you when you needed it most. And sometimes it came with wings.